Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, HIPAA and Encryption, the Best Practices. My name is Josh Berman and I'm the Senior Marketing Coordinator for OnRamp. I will be the moderator for today's presentation. In this webinar, we will cover the following: understanding HIPAA's take on the topic of encryption, discussing the challenges of encrypting data in transit and at rest, using NIST guidelines as a standard for encryption, and best practices for accurately deploying and maintaining encryption. Our goal is to keep the webinar to as close to 40 minutes as possible. To keep things moving, we will answer all questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat window throughout the webinar, and we will answer all that we can during our Q&A session. Leading this discussion, I have with me today Chad Kissinger, founder of OnRamp. Since starting OnRamp in 1994 as one of Texas' first ISPs, Chad has led the growth and development of the company into a leading high security and hybrid hosting provider, serving businesses in the healthcare, financial services, and other industries in meeting their IT and compliance needs. Alongside Chad, we have Jeremiah Martin, Senior Engineer at OnRamp. Jeremiah is a senior IT professional with over 15 years of consulting experience in IT security, audit compliance, and project management, with extensive work within the HIPAA, PCI, SOX, and NIST frameworks. Gentlemen, thank you both for taking the time to talk with us today. And now, Jeremiah, I would like to pass the conversation over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think today what we're discussing is just the need for encryption and the change in the landscape that we've seen. Over the years, we've had a shift. A lot of times most of the people are going after credit card data or something that can financially make them secure. We've seen a shift, of course, due to computing needs. We're in a cloud world. We got more virtual machines out there. I'd like to make a note of the recent trend taking shape in the healthcare industry. As many of you are probably aware, in early May, the Panama Institute released its 5th annual Privacy and Security Report. In this report, it was revealed that criminal attacks have exceeded lost or stolen computing devices. So what we're seeing is more pulling stuff in transition versus actually breaching actual servers, stealing actual laptops, stuff like that. This trend speaks volumes regarding the evolving security climate, and in relation to today's topic, it emphasizes the need for encrypting data in transit and at rest. And we'll sort of talk about what to do in that transition period and give some cause for applying encryption practices that sort of go above and beyond HIPAA standards today. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think it would be best to pass things over to Chad to discuss HIPAA's take on encryption.
Thank you, Jeremiah. It's very interesting. I find it interesting that the criminal attack is now overtaking the loss of media is the big one. In the past, we saw the big thing that we would see is laptops being lost, and now we're seeing hackers getting onto servers, and encryption is obviously increasingly important. But obviously, today's topic is about best practices with HIPAA encryption, and the obvious first best practice is to understand what HIPAA says about encryption. Real quickly, as most of you know, or those that have been involved with HIPAA, HIPAA has 3 general rules that talk about what you have to do. One is the privacy rule, which in my words just generally says what data is sensitive and who can see it, who can't, and what are the rights of the patient to interact with that data. Then there's the security rule, which is primarily involved in the administrative, physical, and technical measures that you have to take to protect the confidentiality, availability, and integrity, or the privacy, the uptime, and the accuracy of the data. So that's the security rule. And then there's the breach notification rule, which talks about really what do you have to do, or what do you have to do if the privacy rule is broken, if the security rule fails. And the security rule, the privacy rule really doesn't talk about encryption a lot, but the security rule and the breach notification rule do, and they do in a kind of an interesting way. First of all, the HIPAA security rule has these things called implementation specifications and implementation standards that are either addressable or required in their implementation. You have to either do them or think about them, basically. And they've split up the encryption requirements under HIPAA in kind of 2 groups. One is encryption requirements for data that's at rest or not moving. That's data that's on a hard drive or on a USB key or something like that, or on a laptop. And then encryption standards for data that's in transit, data that's moving, is being transmitted across the internet or across the network. And the standards for data at rest are addressable, and the standards for encrypted or protected data in transit are required. And what addressable means is, under HIPAA, is that the person that's examining the compliance of the data has to consider whether it's reasonable and appropriate to encrypt the data. Usually it's appropriate. When our business here at OnRamp, we see that it's pretty much always appropriate to encrypt the data, but sometimes it may not be reasonable. And the instances where we see that is when we have customers with special applications that are trying to insert or read from databases very quickly, or they have some particular difficulty in their particular instance that makes it, not necessarily reasonable to do the encryption on a server that's not going to move out of the data center or out of a protected area or something like that. So in that instance, the fact that the standard is an addressable standard says that's okay. They don't have to do encryption, but they must. If they don't do it, if they find that it's not reasonable or appropriate, they have to document their thinking about why that's not reasonable or appropriate, and they have to consider alternate measures that they can do that would reduce the risk associated with not encrypting the data, and do those measures if those are reasonable and appropriate. So encryption of data at rest under HIPAA is addressable. Encryption for data in transit across unsecured networks, that would be the internet or any network where somebody that's unauthorized by the privacy rule to see the data might be, is absolutely required. You have to do it. So that's the first requirement under HIPAA. Under the security rule, it very simply says encryption for data at rest is addressable. You need to do it if it's reasonable and appropriate, and if not, you need to do something else to protect it if it's reasonable and appropriate. And encryption for data at rest, in transit, is absolutely required. Now, what does that mean, though? And what is there a standard for how strong the encryption needs to be and how you need to perform the encryption? And actually, there is. And that requirement is talked about in the breach notification rule. And this is often missed by people that are trying to be compliant and have gone to a lot of effort to be compliant, because it doesn't say the requirement right in the breach notification rule. It just says that Health and Human Services will issue guidance, and then you have to go find that guidance. And it's kind of hard to find sometimes. But we've done that. This is the guidance that Health and Human Services has put out. These are the standards by which people that are dealing with EPHI, when they're encrypting, can make data unreadable and unusable and unrecoverable. And they have these different standards for both data at rest and data in motion. And the first standard under the breach notification rule for encryption for data at rest is a NIST document, National Institute of Standards and Technologies document, called SP 800-111. And it's a guide to storage encryption technologies for end-user devices. Now, if you go read this guide, it primarily discusses how to encrypt or how to protect portable devices like laptops or cell phones and things like that. And it really doesn't talk at all about how to encrypt data in a data center or in a facility like OnRamp. So there's not a whole lot of direction there, but it does set a standard for the level of encryption or the types of ciphers that you use to encrypt data. And that standard under this document, it recommends what's called FIPS compliancy, Federal Information Processing Standard compliancy. And then the next standard below that that we have listed up on this slide are the valid encryption processes for data in motion. And those are those that comply with NIST Special Publication 800-52 and NIST 800-77. And those are guides that talk about how to properly encrypt transportation layer sessions. And most people know those as SSL sessions or HTTPS sessions. Those are the sessions you form when you connect to a web browser to a secure site. So there's a publication on how to do that appropriately. And it's very important, obviously, for all of our customers that are using web-based applications or any type of IP-based web-facing application. And then 800-77 is a guide to IPsec VPNs, which is used a lot by, in our instance, in our data center, is used a lot by systems administrators and other users that need to have a more complete access to the servers than just a web page access. And both of these NIST documents also say that you have to be FIPS 140-2 compliant to have properly encrypted the data. Now, becoming FIPS compliant can be difficult. It can be hard to find. When you go to a vendor's website, it can be difficult to see if their particular product can do FIPS, and it's even more difficult to find out how you can configure that product to be in FIPS compliant mode. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology again, created a program called the Cryptographic Module Verification Program, or CMVP. And we've got a link up here that you can click through to it, but you can also Google search CMVP space list, L-I-S-T. And what they've done with this program is they've looked at cryptographic modules, and cryptographic module is two fancy words that basically mean a piece of hardware or a piece of software that's encrypting or decrypting data. So examples of cryptographic modules are firewalls, routers sometimes do it, libraries that are often used in computing do it. Those of you that are using Linux or an Apache stack or a LAMP stack to offer TLS sessions to people or web applications to people are probably using OpenSSL as your cryptographic module on Linux. So NIST has created this program whereby the vendors or the creators of this hardware or software that's going to encrypt or decrypt can go submit their product to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they test it. They test it to see that if it can be made compliant and forced to operate in a FIPS compliant mode. And what they do once it's passed is they enter this cryptographic module on a list of approved vendors, of certified vendors. These people have been certified to be producing products that are going to operate in FIPS compliant mode. And when you go to that list, what you do is you search for the name of the cryptographic module. So what I've done is I've gone to the list and I searched for an ASA 5512, which is a model number of a well-used, well-known Cisco firewall, which does terminates IPsec VPNs and a variety of cryptographic operations. And what we've done is on that list, when you see ASA 5512, we search for it. At the link where it shows that it's certified, it has a link to a document called a security policy that's been written and maintained by Cisco. And when you click through that link on that security policy, you'll arrive at the PDF document, and I've got a cover of it here and an excerpt from it. And what's really neat about that document is it not only tells you how to properly deploy and how the device operates and how it maintains cryptographic authenticity, it tells you how to configure it and how to test that it's properly configured. And here's up here on the right side of this slide, you can see an example of the commands that you type into a Cisco ASA 5512 to make it operate in purely FIPS compliant mode. And then later on in that document, there's some commands you can type in to get it to report back to you that it's properly doing that. So by knowing what HIPAA says and by choosing the proper ciphers and proper encryption levels, and by ensuring that we've got compliant encryption devices and modules to use, we've gone a long way to addressing properly encrypting our EPHI. But there are other concerns and there are other things that we need to think about, and there are other measures that we can take to complement our efforts at just choosing knowing what to do, what to encrypt, and what to encrypt with. And I'd like to pass it back a little bit to Jeremiah to talk about some of those other key best practices that can help us supplement choosing the best cipher.
All right, thank you, Chad. That was a great intro. First off, I'd just like to sort of explain the idea of encryption first off so we all understand what we're looking at. Encryption does not guarantee that your stuff is protected. I mean, that's the one thing to realize. This is a mathematical algorithm that can be broken. For those of you who are familiar, if you're from a tech world, maybe you're familiar with the 8 queens theory. If you're not, maybe you're familiar with the wheat or rice and the chessboard for the king as an exponential, algorithm. Encryption is exactly the same way. So for right now, we're looking at AES 256 as sort of our gold standard, what we want to use out there. There's a lot of stuff that's still 128-bit encrypted. What this means is that there's not enough computing power and resources right now to actually crack those codes. Now, that said, as computing resources improve, as technology improves, we're going to see that coming to, outdated standard. So when you look at sort of how to encrypt stuff and what to encrypt, you've got to keep that in mind that eventually you will need to update this stuff. It's not a one-time deal. You need to look at what benefits your culture and what you need to encrypt to protect your data while still allowing people to work. So we're going to look at sort of separating your keys from your data, how to do that, what type of algorithms are useful, strength versus processing power, the longevity of them, and of course key management. First off, when you do encrypt something, you're going to have a key to decrypt it. So you want to make sure those are stored properly. There's a bunch of different avenues to follow there. Some people use them on external thumb drives. Some people have hard copies. You want to make sure that you have these keys separate from the data so that if someone gains access to the server, the key is not stored right there on the server. They can get to it.
And in fact, real quickly, if I can interrupt, that's a requirement of HIPAA and the breach notification rule is that if you have a piece of media like a hard drive or a tape or something, an external drive that's been lost, and you can prove that it's properly encrypted, that's great. But if you can't prove that the key is secure still, if it's on the device, then you have to do breach notification. So
exactly.
It's important to keep the key.
I mean, it's sort of like the idea of the laptops. You know, if you lose a laptop that's an unencrypted laptop, you're looking at quite a big fine from HIPAA. You're looking at quite a big data risk. You're looking at tons of stuff that could happen. Drive's encrypted, you're out $1,000 for the laptop. That's all you're really worried about.
That's right. So keep the key separate.
Exactly. And, when you're managing those keys, you also want to do balance of powers. If you have key custodians, you want to separate those out. You also need to make sure you have backups in case something happens to them so that you can access it still. And, of course, the big thing that I think becomes a problem down the road is sort of we were talking about how the algorithms will eventually become outdated. Well, so events and expirations also will come up, and you'll have to rotate those keys. So when you're doing that, you need to keep in mind that if your CISO leaves and he's one of your key custodians, you need to rotate those keys. If you have a developer who has full access to those, you need to rotate those keys at that time. So not only expirations, but you want to look at events that happen that would cause you to actually redo your encryption and rotate those keys out.
And that's interesting you say that because that directly addresses what we were talking about in the first slide, which is that people have been thinking about losing the media,
the hardware,
and then having to do breach notification.
Right.
And now we're thinking about malicious activity because the data is so worthwhile, it's worth so much money.
Exactly.
That there's a good financial reason for people to try and steal it, and we need to think about not just people outside the organization, but possible malicious actors inside the organization.
Right.
So that's why that's where you need to think about changing keys if somebody inside the organization's changed.
Right, and we also have to think about how to encrypt stuff. Whereas we move away from laptops and standalone servers, we move into cloud architecture and the virtual environment. How do we encrypt it to make sure that it's safe? You look at different types of encryption, what's going to work best for your environment. Encryptions can be expensive. There's hardware encryption, there's software encryption. Which one works best for you? We need to look at different types of encryption, be it disk level encryption or file level encryption. When you look at a laptop, obviously that's someone's personal laptop that they're using for business. Full disk encryption makes perfect sense, but the problem is once someone gains access to that laptop, they have the keys to the kingdom. So when you look at a server environment, if you have a domain admin who accesses a server to do maintenance, to do needed work for the business, or you have a developer that needs to write code and access that data, you give them permissions to the actual full disk, they have permissions to everything on that disk. So there's ways to mitigate it, but also along those lines, you can look at different ideas of file level encryption. If the people need to access the server, but they don't need to access the data, let's go ahead and lock that down and encrypt the actual files themselves or directories. One thing to keep in mind at this point is if you have people on there with a full disk encryption, all your basic security principles need to be followed as well. You want to make sure that your malware is protected. You have a domain admin logs on, they have some malware installed on that computer, your data is now compromised. We also look at, in this area, we look at people who do need access to the data for specific purposes. One of the best examples would be people coding for an environment. They need access to the actual PHI data or credit card data. They need to be able to access that data to write their programs, to make their programs run. Encryption may not work best in that scenario. You also can do other things like truncate it and mask the data so that those people can access the data to write their code or to do their job, but they don't have to actually be able to see the data, so you protect yourself in that way.
So this is where, we skip, I think we're a little bit ahead of ourselves, but I think the thing that we're talking about is how to choose the proper encryption at rest.
Correct.
And what you've covered is if we encrypt a hard drive, if we use hard drive encryption or volume encryption, or something that's done below the operating system, in my words, then anybody that gets into the operating system is not going to be protected by the encryption. They're going to have open access. The hardware and the software is de-encrypting the data for them to see.
Right. So if you get someone who has full permissions to that box,
or a virus,
logged on,
like you say, like a virus. Let's say the systems administrator accidentally clicked on the wrong link, and he has access, or she has access, and the virus takes over, and that data is not encrypted. Well, now the data can be compromised, can be copied out of that environment. So another type of encryption would be possibly to choose software encryption or database encryption, or file level encryption.
File level encryption, where you can encrypt the data that's actually important to your environment. They can still access everything they need to on the server, whether it's doing backups, whether it's doing patch management, anything along those lines. but you're not allowing them to the data that could be put at risk. And that's if their account was compromised, not necessarily if they're a malicious insider. You do have to protect against a malicious insider.
Everything.
Correct.
Compartmentalize everything. Right.
Correct. Balance of power. Sort of when we were talking about key rotation, you have the two people who have a split key. So that way, if one person does not have full access to all the decryption. So you have to have both people agree, both people in there, and you have their backups.
So these aren't requirements of HIPAA, but
these aren't requirements. These are more best practices.
These would be things that would be be reasonable and appropriate to supplement.
Correct.
If you didn't encrypt something, or if you chose just hard drive encryption instead of software encryption. Right?
Agreed. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, there's different things you can do to sort of protect your data, keep your stuff up to date. Obviously, it's one of the biggest things out there. Managing your keys and sort of having a policy of what you're going to do in case there's a scenario. If the CISO walks off immediately, you need a policy in place of how to rotate the keys, and you need to practice that. In certain environments, it could take a lot of resources to actually decrypt and re-encrypt all your data. I've seen places where it can take up to 6 months to go through that process, depending on how much code and proprietary stuff you're writing in-house.
And I think that's a good subject to touch on real quickly is the cost of encrypting and the difficulty of encrypting and the danger of encrypting.
Right.
Everybody wants to encrypt everything. Well, let's encrypt everything.
Exactly.
But there's some gotchas. It's expensive to do.
Exactly.
It creates a burden because you have to do this rotation either periodically because it's just a requirement of cryptography. And the reason why you do it periodically is if somebody has surveillance on they're seeing the encrypted data. Over time, they could be cracking the code, as it were,
exactly.
on the encryption. So you want to change the key so that they're looking at a different code every once in a while.
And as we were talking about earlier about the actual algorithms used to do the encryption.
And they get weaker, right.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is we'd all love to have the highest bit encryption possible. It's just not reasonable. We would not be able to have the time to actually encrypt everything, decrypt everything. So 256 is sort of our gold standard right now because we don't have the processing power to crack it easily.
Yeah.
It would take years for most, even big environments, big attacks to actually get through that. And so that's what we look at. We look at what time resources it's going to take, what's the actual most reasonable amount of protection you can have right now.
So it's expensive. And then the last thing I think we haven't talked about, right. But we touched upon it, and we touched upon it making sure you have multiple copies of the key and backup copies of the key that obviously need to be secure. But if you lose your key, that's another cost of encryption. You're going to lose all your data.
Correct.
It's just as if all the data was erased.
Correct.
Permanently without a backup.
And I think the biggest problem with key, of course, is that transition period. So I think a lot of people are really good, especially in a cloud environment, of using SSL and keeping things secure, access to the data, because your customers need access to those environments and those services. And your domain admins, everything like that, they need access to certain resources on the servers. You need to find a way to actually protect the data in transition. So when someone logs on, how to protect that either file level, full disk encryption, someone logs onto the server, and just different ways to protect that data while it's being worked on or utilized. And that's where we were talking about the masking the data or de-identify the data so that people can still work with that data but not have full access.
So these are other reasonable and appropriate measures that we could take if we're not encrypting the data.
Correct.
So, yeah, somebody has to use the data, so we want to encrypt it. And this is consistent when we look at other, at OnRamp, here at OnRamp, we don't deal with just HIPAA data. We have companies that are banks that are dealing with what are called Graham-Leach-Bliley data, and we have people that are dealing with PCI data, with credit card data, and a lot of the things that they consistently do in their industries is they try to reduce the scope of the risk, and one of the ways to do that is to cover up the data, to mask it, to make sure that you're not seeing all of it. So that's a complementary measure.
And it's very effective, and again, you can use that from a customer level to not be able to access other people's data, and from an internal level so that your techs, your admins, your developers can still work with that data but not have access to it. The insider threat is always probably the biggest threat you're going to see in the environment. And lastly, there's a couple of encryption gotchas. You look, there's a ton of software out there that can do these for you. PGP, Symantec's the leading resource reseller in the U.S. for that. There's great resources out there that will help you secure your cloud, secure your environment, secure your data center, and sort of walk you through what would be the best way to do that. There's some things you got to consider. You want to consider, make sure that you're using secure protocols for any type of transmitting of the data. Watch your sysadmin access. Unfortunately, they a lot of times in your environments have keys to the kingdom. So you want to make sure that once they're on there, they don't have keys to everything. Watch your backups. There's people use SAN, people use tape backups still. It's hard to say what is good and what's not. You may have stuff. You may have a 7-year rotation plan. Remember, if you're if you're going through the encryption cycle and every 2 years you're renewing your encryption process, go back through and you're going to have to re-encrypt all those backups with your newest technology.
And this is really important. This is the place that when people, other than dealing with laptops and they lose a laptop,
Yeah.
this is the number one place that we see enterprises
Correct.
breach the security and privacy rules and have to do a breach notification, is they lose backup
Correct.
media. So properly encrypting backup media is probably one of the first places an enterprise should look at in protecting themselves.
Exactly. So if I have a 7-year rotation period for my backups, I can guarantee you that 5 to 7 years ago, we were using 128-bit encryption on a tape. So if that tape gets lost, it's not going to take a whole lot of processing power these days to actually crack that and get to the data.
Right.
And of course, logging is a big thing. You know, you always want to be able to know when people were accessing your data, when they attempted, and what they gained access to. You may not find out about a breach or someone getting to your data until afterwards. So you need to be able to go back and find it and make sure that you can see those, how they did it, what they accessed, and what you might need to protect.
And we see some of our clients that are dealing with web-based applications. Oftentimes, they'll generate log messages,
right?
And the log message will contain data that was involved in the error, and that data itself may be PHI. So we need to be thinking about the log itself could be sensitive data, and we need to be careful with that and think about that.
Right.
So with that, I think that
I'll take it from here. So Jeremiah, Chad, thank you both for this insight. We'd now like to open the floor for a Q&A session. We will begin by answering questions submitted via the chat window. If you would like to ask a question, please do so now. We do have one question that has come in over the chat. Do faxes need to be encrypted? How is that handled?
So
that's great.
Yeah, that is a really good question, because fax, I think it's sort of going away now, but I mean, when HIPAA started, it was pretty much the primary way to transmit data between hospitals. You know, it's sort of an older school system, and there really isn't an easy answer for our fax appropriate. Unfortunately, a traditional fax uses the regular phone lines. It's not secure at all. However, HIPAA, doesn't necessarily give you specific guidelines for that. They actually give you regulations to sort of make sure that you're secure. So you want to have policies in place to record that stuff and make sure that, no one's used cover letters, different policies that will help secure that data. The main thing is, if you're still using fax in your environment, there are alternatives to the traditional fax. Most companies nowadays still utilize fax, but they'll submit it through email, which can be encrypted. There are secure faxing methods out there that can be used, but basically, like I said, the main thing is to have the policies in place so that you don't send that fax to the wrong place. Because I think that was one of the first HIPAA violations to come out whenever HIPAA started.
So you need to make sure. So you've addressed an interesting concern, which is how do you ensure that the recipient is who you intended?
That's the main thing.
So fax machines can end up a machine, but other than worrying about that, if you could send a fax and know the recipient is secure. The things that I think that are salient is if it's a real traditional fax that's going across the public switch telephone network,
right.
Generally that's been regarded as it doesn't need to be encrypted. The fax
Correct.
itself is encrypting it. The modulation and demodulation of the fax
Correct.
Across the PSTN itself is. Now, if you have some of these fax emulation programs that it's not really going across the public switch telephone network, but it's being sent across the internet as a packet. Well, then no. I would say that it needs to be encrypted just as anything else does. It needs to be FIPS compliant. It has FIPS and compliant encryption, either in the protocol that it's sent across the internet under, whether that's TLS or something like that, or within the message body of the email.
And I think this is a good area to talk about. Where HIPAA is really interesting, and that it will lay out many requirements, rules, principles, but they're all flexible and don't really prescribe specific practices or actions that must be taken. Right. I think when you look at fax, when you look at your environment, when you look at actually the old mail system, traditional snail mail, this sort of permits organizations to find ways to adequately protect themselves and protect the privacy of PHI that's sort of appropriate to your circumstances. Smaller hospitals still may heavily rely on fax, and they may not have an option to submit it through email or digitally. So it just depends on what your environment is. You need to take the steps to make sure that the data is secure when you're transmitting it, or that it gets to the appropriate recipient and no one can actually access that data from there.
I actually have another question that has come in. When operating in a SaaS environment, does storing the keys and data on a separate server suffice for separating the keys?
Well, it does. So the threshold is, if you've had a breach, whenever you have a security incident in which you think the confidentiality, availability, integrity of the data has been a malicious actor has tried to affect the confidentiality, availability, integrity of the data. That's a security incident. You need to investigate it. And HIPAA, the breach notification rule, has a whole requirement. You're supposed to ask yourself 4 questions of whether it's been exposed or not. And one of those questions deals with, is the key secure? Was it secure? So it depends on the type of breach. If the hacker or whoever compromised it had access to the first server and the second server, then I would say a breach has occurred and your encryption is invalid. If that hacker, after your investigation shows that they only had access to the first server and not the second server, then I think you're fine. It's not a breach at that second. You still have valid enforceable encryption. It's unreadable.
I think that's a great idea. It's an idea of how, when you think about it that way, so storing the key on a separate server is a great idea. But obviously, if someone gains access to one server, they probably can gain access to the second server. And most of it, this comes down to your environment, what works best for you as a company, what works best for you and your custodians. Ideally, what I'd recommend is a split key on thumb drives, and to have those locked up at a bank where it requires both key custodians to show up to decrypt, to gain access to the thumb drives. If not at a bank, there's safes out there that require 2 keys to access.
But to be fair, this can be difficult in a server environment if you want a server to be able to reboot or something like that.
Yeah, it can.
It can be difficult. And in that case, there are types of server systems that'll a key vault.
And this again goes back to whether we're doing full disk encryption or file level encryption. If you have access to the data that's masked and the administrators don't need to do it for patching, something along those lines, if you're actually encrypting the code you're writing or the data itself and you don't need to be able to access that because it's all masked, then we can do off-site keys. Yeah, so if you do need it on-site, there are other ways. Having it on a different server would be good. You can still utilize thumb drives and have a safe on-site to be needed by the key
one of the
custodian.
mistakes we see people doing, oftentimes the key for transmission for a TLS session will be placed on the server because the encryption is meant to protect the data while it's being transmitted, not at rest, right? So the encryption's not intended. That key's never going to be transmitted. It's just on the server. And another mistake that we see people making is when they do encryption at rest. Again, they want that during a reboot, they want that key to be available, so they'll put it somewhere on the computer.
Correct.
And that means it's been compromised at the same time the data has. So
and another option you can do is a key server. You can have a server set up specifically to manage those keys.
A hardened server.
Exactly. And in that server, no one really needs access to it other than the people that need to access those keys. So that's a server that you can lock down. It doesn't need to be available to the public. It doesn't need to be available to other people. That way your maintenance people, your administrators, people like that can still access it and utilize it.
I have another question that's come in. For a REST-style web API service that uses private patient data, is HTTPS sufficient encryption, or should message-level encryption be layered on top of it?
The simple answer is yes, because it meets the requirements. Now, what works best for you in securing your environment is a little different. That's going to depend on your situation, the environment, for me, it's always about going above and beyond without interfering with the day-to-day jobs of your company or environment.
Yeah, so the data being transmitted is obviously REST API is going to be transmitted across the internet or unsecured network.
Right.
And it's HTTPS is a TLS, and that NIST document that we talked about earlier, NIST 800- I'm not going to draw a blank on it now, talks about 800-52 talks about selection and use of transfer TLS implementation. And it would say that all you need to do is that EPHI needs to be encrypted to FIPS compliant level. So whatever cryptographic module, either at the TLS level or HTTPS level or at the message level, whichever cryptographic module is used, it needs to be FIPS compliant and it needs to be placed in FIPS compliant mode. And then either way is sufficient.
I have another question that's come in, and it actually brings up a pretty interesting topic. So, how does HIPAA and encryption apply to mobile devices? It's a hot topic right now. So,
well, it's just in the same way that we've been talking about it before. It's just a mobile. Think of it as a mobile server, a cell phone or a laptop or anything like that it has transmits and stores data. So the standards are the same for both storing the data and transmitting. I can say though that the only special guidance the Office of Civil Rights of HHS, the people that enforce HIPAA, have put out since HIPAA's been put out has been about an announcement that they're really having a big trouble with laptops and mobile devices. So the standard measures that Jeremiah talked about earlier stand with mobile devices. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest concerns I see these days with mobile devices is they have full access. We have Outlook, you have your email, you have iDrive, you have different things you can access to gain you more data. There are ways, policies is your best way to control that. I would restrict access to most of it. Another big concern I see with a lot of the mobile devices nowadays are hotspots, rogue hotspots in your environment. It gives anyone that would have malicious intent the ability to transmit large amounts of data in and out of your environment. So those are a couple of things to really keep an eye on in your environment, depending on what goes on.
Can text messages be encrypted is another question that came.
So not just through SMS. So what you'll see, and we spend a lot of time at the American Telemedicine Association conventions, and we see a lot of, at that convention, there's a lot of innovators there that are coming out with different ways to transmit ePHI. And I would say that what we see is, you see people that want to transmit data across the internet or through email or all that. There's a variety of ways that they can do it, but what I see people doing is they end up sending a simple message through email saying that, hey, you've got some info, your doctor wants to talk to you, he sent you a message, and then you log in through a portal, which is, of course, a web portal doing an HTTPS or TLS session that's properly encrypted, and then you get the data through that portal. And then similarly, what we see through text messages is not people using through the standard text message infrastructure. They'll create an application that emulates text messaging that has its encryption in it. So no, you shouldn't send ePHI through a normal text message.
And that applies to SMS, iMessage. Those just aren't really,
they're not encrypted,
secure enough.
Getting a lot of great questions here, and actually this kind of plays off of our involvement with the ATA. One question asks, if I'm looking for a secure video conferencing solution to speak to patients, what questions should I ask the company about their encryption to ensure I'm covering my bases?
Well, obviously that video is going to be transmitted across an unsecured network at some point, so you want to make sure that they're encrypting that data all the way from the point that their secure network touches the internet or the unsecured network, all the way to the point in your network that does that. So that you can do that really two ways, or two general ways. There's probably several side cases. One is if let's say it was a clinic and a hospital, and you were going to have patients in the clinic see doctors in the hospital, and there were two static locations, you could get the firewalls and set them up with permanent VPNs in between them that were properly encrypted, and that would be the best way because you would always know the encryption is better. And then you wouldn't really have to worry about the application itself. The application wouldn't need to worry about the encryption. You would be encrypting. That video would never be transmitted across an unsecured network because you secure the network itself. And the other way is through the application. So it's either from the device that's taking the video, or on the application all the way to the device where the video is being viewed, and that's typically through a web browser or web server, web browser negotiation. And again, that's a FIPS compliant TLS session or HTTPS session. So if the encryption is going to be, that would be used if you have a patient that's maybe roaming or talking to you through their laptop or her laptop or her cell phone or something like that. So in that case, you would want a secure TLS session that's properly encrypted. So you would ask that vendor, how are we encrypting this data as it crosses the internet, and how is that FIPS compliant? Can you prove to me that that's done in a FIPS compliant mode?
And there's a great thing these days. We're sort of moving ahead in technology. We're getting away from standard phone lines, especially in the corporate environment. We're not seeing a lot of, people use it. And so back to the fax discussion, most people, even the faxes that are being transmitted, aren't going over through standard phone lines. They're being converted digitally, transmitted, and then, converted back. So when you look at a lot of, even Skype, or, most of the professional ones aren't going to use Skype, but even Skype is encrypted. They use TLS, they use AES, they use good encryption standards. Pretty much most of your digital mediums that you're using to talk these days are going to be encrypted. In a corporate environment, you'd want to use something a little enterprise level, Cisco, something along those lines to do your, video conferencing, stuff like that. All of that is encrypted. So we're at a point where it's good. Now, the thing to consider, though, if you're using some of that technology, whether it's Cisco Voice Connect, Skype, any of those lines, some people still will connect up from standard phone lines. That will not be encrypted. So, that's one of those things. If you're doing it corporate to corporate, you're probably safe, but make sure your environment's in a place where it can be encrypted and it actually is going over digital. So once it gets connected to analog or cellular, you run the risk of people being able to access that data.
Okay, well, I think we've just about run out of our time here. Thank you, Chad and Jeremiah.
Thank you.
If you'd like more information about OnRamp's HIPAA-compliant hosting solutions, please visit us online at www.onr.com/HIPAA. To stay up to date with our latest news and events, connect with us on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for direct access to today's webinar recording. On behalf of OnRamp, we'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Thank you.